Daniel Carter slammed his car door and ran through the freezing Chicago wind, clutching a small brown package under his arm. Snow whipped across the empty street, stinging his face as he hurried toward the dimly lit porch of a large house at the end of the block. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Another notification from his bank. He didn't even need to open it to know what it said. Low balance. Again. Daniel exhaled slowly, pressing the doorbell. The cold had seeped through his thin jacket hours ago. He had been delivering packages since early morning, driving across half the city. But the harder he worked, the more it felt like he was running in place. The porch light flicked on. A moment later, the door opened. An older man stood there, calm and composed, wearing a warm sweater and glasses. Behind him, the house glowed with soft yellow light. Daniel handed over the package. "Delivery," he said, forcing a polite smile. The man nodded. "Late night out there." "Yeah," Daniel replied. "Snow makes everything slower." The man studied him for a second, noticing the exhaustion in Daniel's face. "You look like someone who's been running all day." Daniel chuckled lightly. "Pretty much every day." The man thanked him and closed the door. Daniel turned and walked back toward his car, snow crunching beneath his boots. As he sat behind the wheel, his phone buzzed again. This time he looked. $47.16. That was everything he had until the next paycheck. Daniel leaned his head back against the seat and stared at the car ceiling. He was 29 years old, working 10-hour days delivering packages, living in a cramped apartment with peeling paint and a fridge that was almost always empty. And somehow, no matter how hard he worked, nothing ever seemed to change. If you've ever felt like life is moving forward for everyone else except you, then you might understand exactly how Daniel felt in that moment. And if that feeling has ever hit you before, let me ask you something. What time is it right now where you're watching this? Drop it in the comments. Daniel started the engine and pulled away from the curb, the headlights cutting through the falling snow. The drive back to his apartment took nearly 40 minutes. When he finally walked through the door, the place was silent. A dim lamp in the corner barely lit the small living room. The couch had a tear along one side. The heater rattled loudly every few minutes. Daniel tossed his keys on the table and opened the fridge. Half a carton of milk, 1 egg, a bottle of ketchup. He stared at it for a second before closing the door again. Dinner tonight would be instant noodles. Again. He dropped onto the couch, rubbing his face with both hands. This had been his life for years now. Wake up late, rush to work, deliver packages all day, come home exhausted, scroll on his phone for hours, sleep, repeat. Day after day, week after week, year after year. He worked harder than most people he knew, but somehow he was still stuck. One night, a few weeks later, the snow returned. A heavy storm rolled across Chicago, coating the streets in thick white layers. Daniel's delivery route was behind schedule, and the roads were nearly empty. By the time he reached the final house on his list, it was close to 10 at night. The address looked familiar. The same house, the same porch, the same man. Daniel rang the bell. The door opened again, and the older man smiled slightly when he saw him. "Back again," he said. Daniel handed him the package. "Yeah, busy week." The man stepped aside slightly. "You look frozen. Come inside for a second." Daniel hesitated. Company rules technically didn't allow that, but the warmth pouring from the house felt impossible to resist. He stepped in. The air inside was warm and calm. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a wooden desk stood near the window. But something else caught Daniel's attention. A large whiteboard mounted on the wall. It was filled with writing, goals, schedules, lists, dates. Daniel stared at it for a moment. The man noticed. "You've never seen one of those before?" Daniel shrugged. "Not like that." The man walked over and tapped the board. Most people think success is complicated, but it usually comes down to something much simpler. Daniel tilted his head. "Like what?" The man turned toward him. "Let me ask you something first." He folded his arms. Do you know why most people stay stuck in life? Daniel thought for a second. No idea. The man smiled slightly. Because they wake up every morning and react to life instead of designing it. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? He pointed to the whiteboard. Every night before I go to bed, I spend 15 minutes planning tomorrow. Daniel blinked. That's it? The man nodded. I call it designing tomorrow tonight. Daniel looked skeptical. Are you telling me writing a to-do list changes someone's life? The man chuckled. No, not a to-do list. He grabbed a marker and wrote 3 lines on the board. 3 important actions. 1 step toward your future, 1 action for your health. That's the system, he said. Daniel stared at the words. That doesn't seem like much. The man turned back toward him. That's what I thought too when someone first told me about it 30 years ago. He paused. And yet, every major thing that happened in my life started with those 15 minutes. Daniel looked around the house, the calm atmosphere, the shelves filled with books, the quiet confidence in the man's voice. You're saying this built everything? The man nodded slowly. Success rarely comes from one big moment. He pointed to the board again. It comes from one small habit repeated every day. Daniel drove home that night thinking about those words. Design tomorrow tonight. It sounded almost too simple, but something about it stayed in his mind. The next evening, after another long day of deliveries, Daniel sat at his small kitchen table. In front of him was a cheap notebook he had picked up from a dollar store. He opened it. The blank page stared back at him. For a moment, he almost laughed. Could something this small really change anything? Still, he picked up a pen. 3 important things tomorrow. He wrote the first one, wake up earlier. Then the second, watch 1 lesson from an online marketing course he had bookmarked months ago but never started. Then the third, save $20. He paused. 1 step toward the future. He thought for a moment before writing, learn digital marketing. 1 action for health. Go for a 30-minute walk. Daniel looked at the list. It didn't seem life-changing. It just looked like a few simple notes. He closed the notebook and went to bed. The next morning, his alarm rang. Daniel stared at the ceiling for a moment. Normally, he would hit snooze, but then he remembered the notebook. Slowly, he sat up. Maybe, just maybe, he would try it for 30 days and see what happened. Little did he know, that decision would quietly begin changing the direction of his entire life. He opened his laptop and searched for the marketing course he had bookmarked months ago. The video began to play. At first, it felt strange. His brain kept telling him this wouldn't matter, but he kept watching. 30 minutes passed. Then he got ready for work. That day, something small felt different. Daniel wasn't rushing as much. He knew what his priorities were. And that night, when he came home exhausted, he almost forgot about the notebook. Almost. But right before going to bed, he opened it again. Another page. 3 important things tomorrow. 1 step toward the future. 1 action for health. Day 2 began the same way. Then day 3. Then day 4. The first week felt awkward. The second week felt slightly easier. But the third week was when something unexpected happened. Daniel began noticing time. Not extra time. Time that had always been there but had been wasted. Hours scrolling on his phone. Hours watching random videos. Hours drifting through the evening with no direction. But now, every night, he asked himself one question. What matters tomorrow? That single question began changing everything. One night, while writing his list, Daniel paused. He stared at the line that said, 1 step toward the future. For the past 2 weeks, he had written the same thing, learn digital marketing. But now he had finished several lessons, and suddenly an idea appeared. What if he tried helping a real business? The next day, while delivering packages, Daniel stopped at a small pizza restaurant he had visited many times before. The owner, Carlos, stood behind the counter. Daniel hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Hey, can I ask you something?" Carlos nodded. "Sure." Daniel scratched the back of his head. "I've been learning some stuff about online marketing." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "And?" Daniel continued. "I noticed your restaurant doesn't show up very well online." Carlos laughed. "That doesn't surprise me." Daniel swallowed. "Well, if you want, I could try helping improve it." Carlos folded his arms. "You charge?" Daniel hesitated. "No, not at first." Carlos studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "All right, go ahead." Daniel left the restaurant that day feeling both nervous and excited. That night, when he opened his notebook, his handwriting looked slightly different, more confident. 3 important things tomorrow. Work on Carlos's online listings. Finish 1 course lesson. Walk 30 minutes. Day after day, he continued the routine. Design tomorrow, tonight. Weeks passed, then months. Slowly, the small changes began adding up. Daniel stopped wasting hours online. He woke up earlier. He learned faster. Carlos's restaurant began receiving more online orders. One afternoon, Daniel walked in to pick up his usual slice of pizza. Carlos called him over. "You did something," he said. Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Carlos pointed to his phone. Online orders went up almost 30%. Daniel blinked. "Really?" Carlos nodded. "Yeah." He reached into the register and pulled out an envelope. "Here." Daniel opened it. Inside was $600. His eyes widened. "I can't take this." Carlos shook his head. "You earned it." Daniel stood there frozen for a moment. $600. It wasn't millions, but it was the first time he had ever been paid for something he created himself, not for hours worked, but for value provided. That night, Daniel opened his notebook again, but this time something felt different. He stared at the words he had written weeks ago, 1 step toward the future. Now he understood what that meant. The next few months moved quickly. Daniel continued learning, continued helping small businesses, continued writing his plan every night before bed. Design tomorrow, tonight. The phrase had become part of his life. Some nights he felt exhausted. Some nights he doubted himself. But the notebook stayed on the table every single night. And slowly the results kept coming. Another business hired him, then another, then another. Within a year, Daniel was earning more from his small marketing work than from delivering packages. But the moment that changed everything came on a quiet Tuesday morning. Daniel sat inside his delivery van staring at his schedule. 42 stops, another 10-hour shift. He looked down at the notebook resting on the passenger seat. For months, he had been writing something new in the future step line: build my own business. His heart began beating faster. Could he actually do it? The safe choice was to keep the job, the familiar routine. But something inside him had changed. He pulled out his phone. His manager answered. "Daniel?" Daniel took a breath. "I think it's time I move on." There was silence for a moment. Then his manager replied calmly, "Well, I can't say I'm surprised." Daniel laughed nervously. "Why not?" "Because people who start planning their lives usually stop working jobs like this." Daniel hung up the phone and sat quietly in the van. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of the future. 2 years later, the same street in Chicago looked very different. The same snow fell gently across the neighborhood. But Daniel wasn't delivering packages anymore. Inside his apartment, a large desk sat near the window. 2 monitors glowed softly. On the wall above the desk hung something simple, a whiteboard, covered with plans, goals, ideas. Daniel leaned back in his chair as another client notification appeared on his screen, a new contract. He smiled quietly. Then he stood up and walked to the kitchen table. The notebook was still there, worn, filled with pages, thousands of small plans written night after night. Daniel opened to a fresh page. 3 important things tomorrow. He began writing, because the habit had never stopped. Success hadn't come from one big moment. It had come from thousands of small decisions, one planned day at a time. Before we finish this story, I want to ask you something. If you were to try this habit tonight, what would you write for tomorrow? Tell me in the comments. And if stories like this inspire you to grow, change, and build a better life, make sure you subscribe to the channel and like this video so you don't miss the next story. Because sometimes the difference between the life you have and the life you want is just one small habit you start today.